Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our study in the book of Exodus. And if you'll look at this screen over here, for the last several weeks and chapters, we have been going through what is commonly known as the 10 plagues in Egypt. And I've explained for several weeks that they are grouped in a literary pattern of a series of triads, right? Where the first, fourth, and seventh, second, fifth, and eighth, third, sixth, and ninth plagues, as far as the literary design, how it's written, and the things that happen in those triads kind of mirror each other with minor variants here and there. But that has brought us to the point to where last week we went through chapter 11, which is God speaking with Moses about the 10th and final plague and what's going to take place. And then the narrative that we've been in for a long time, the historical narrative of the events in Egypt, is interrupted by what is called law or legal matter. And it seems kind of interruptive to us because we're not used to an abrupt change. But in their culture, in their day, this would have been very normal. And what it does is it highlights that God is interested in the specifics of how things are done. And he's very detailed in his request and his demands for how things are to be done and are expected to be carried out. And we've seen that part of the purpose of this insertion is they need to know how to prepare for this 10th and final plague, because it's not only going to affect Egypt, it's going to affect them. And in the process, God institutes what we call the redemptive calendar, right? Where he gives requirements based on the Passover and unleavened bread, things that they will keep for generations to come, ultimately finding their fulfillment in Christ. And I mentioned last week that we have done a series, twice actually, since we've started the church, on God's redemptive calendar, and I encouraged everyone to go back and to watch or listen to those, because it will help you to understand why God initiated what we're reading here in the redemptive calendar, how Israel was to observe it up until Christ, how Christ brought fulfillment to the calendar, and how that should translate into our lives as Christians, because things change. Even the Passover, when you study through the Torah, the Passover itself evolved and changed in how they were to keep it. Matter of fact, we see in the introduction here in chapter 12 of how they are to keep it, but they will never keep the Passover the same way as they will here in Egypt, right? Because circumstances will never be the same. And so there are aspects of what they will do this night that will carry over, and principles that will carry over. But the primary purpose for them keeping this feast from generation to generation, year after year, is to teach their children where they came from, which shows the power of tradition and ritual. And I actually put something in our Facebook group. If you're a part of our Facebook group, I put a excursus that kind of shows the connection of the Passover with the Lord's Supper. Because again, how they kept the Passover changed when you look in Deuteronomy 16. There were instructions given right before they enter into the land of Canaan on how it would change, in that it would include the temple and how they would observe the Passover. And then the Lord changed it in what we call the Lord's Supper. And so the Passover has been something that has evolved throughout centuries and millennium. And for the last 2,000 years, on a weekly basis, most churches keep the Lord's Supper, which is an updated version of the Passover. And so it's very, very important. I would encourage you guys to go read that excursus, because I think it's very meaningful in regards to what we've seen introduced here in chapter 12. And so God has introduced this calendar that they will keep. And he's put an emphasis on how they are to keep it, right? That they have a lamb or a goat for a family. If it's not a large family, then families come together under one home. They kill the lamb or the goat in the doorway. They take the blood, put it on the side post and over the lintel, and then they roast it. They cook it the fastest way that they had possible at that time. They cook it, they roast it, and they eat it. They leave nothing to be remaining, right? Whatever was left, they were to burn with fire. And they were to prepare to leave Egypt that night into the next morning, because he said that he would pass through the land and he would bring judgment on the firstborn of the Egyptians, which I explained is kind of a retribution. God bringing punishment for what the Egyptians had done to the Hebrew children in casting them into the Nile. And so we made it through chapter 12, verse 28. And what we're going to try to do tonight is cover the rest of chapter 12. So we could get done early. And I vacillated the last several days whether or not to do the first 16 verses or so of chapter 13. But I want to do justice to it when we go through it, because there's some important principles there in that chapter that set the precedents, really, that extend back to Genesis 4 and really go through the rest of the Bible. And that is that our first, our very best, belongs to God. He's entitled to it. And quite frankly, He's demanded it of us. And so we'll talk about that most likely next week. But we're going to pick up in verse 29. Okay, so we've had 28 verses of law, legal instructions of how they are to keep the Passover that night and generations to come. And now it's going to transition back into the historical narrative, where we're going to read about the actual Exodus. And surprisingly, for an event that's so important, there's not a lot of detail given to the actual Exodus, as we'll see. And then we're going to see, I think when we get to verse 43, that there's going to be an interruption again, where law or legal matter will be inserted back into the narrative, interrupting the flow of the narrative. And the reason why we see the legal matter inserted again is because it's going to tell us the who of Passover. Who can participate in the Passover. And so we'll get to that here in just a moment. But let's start in verse 29. It says, "And it came to pass that at midnight," or in the middle of the night, chetzi, Belila, "the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt." Now, what's not made clear is if the firstborn was males only or any firstborn. There's kind of a debate on that, but the text does not actually come out and say. Now, when we get to chapter 13, we'll see that God requires the firstborn males of the livestock and the redemption of the firstborn male children to be redeemed with the 5 shekels that would go to ultimately the tabernacle and then the temple later on as a means of redemption. So you could kind of push that back into what we see here, but the text doesn't come out and say, and quite frankly, I haven't seen enough evidence one way or the other to say that I would even know for sure. So it says, "He smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle." So during the night, God brings judgment in taking the lives of all the firstborn of man and cattle, livestock. And it affects even Pharaoh, which is very significant, because Pharaoh in Egypt was considered to be a son of the gods. And so this would have been a polemical blow against the gods of Egypt, as if the other plagues weren't already. And so many see this as a direct blow against Osiris, who was the god of the dead in Egyptian culture. And so again, just like all of the other plagues, Yahweh is showing his preeminence and his power over the gods that were worshipped in Egypt in this plague. And we're going to see that this plague is ultimately the plague or the sign that breaks the will of Pharaoh. Right? He has continually hardened his heart, hardened his resolve to imprison and enslave the Israelites, and this plague is going to change that. Verse 30, and Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, which would mirror the cry that would have went throughout the Hebrew encampment earlier on in Exodus, right? And so the Egyptians are crying out, as if they weren't crying like crazy during the plagues, right? I mean, if you just like envision yourself like going through those plagues, I mean, you're talking about plagues that last over several months, where you have one plague after another, from water being turned to blood, you can't find water to drink, you have to go and dig for it, to the frogs, to the lice, to the flies, to the disease in the livestock, to the boils, to the hail and fire. I mean, you think about all the damage, and then you go from that to the locusts, just eating what the hail didn't damage, and then you go to the darkness, and now it hits home most pointedly in that the firstborn are dead. And there's nothing they can do to stop it. And that's part of the point. Yahweh was showing that he is the greatest and the most powerful being. He is the creator. And so there was not a house where there was not one dead. Verse 31. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, rise up and get you forth from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go and serve Yahweh as you have said. Now, based on what we read at the end of chapter 10, when Moses stood before Pharaoh, Pharaoh gave him strict instructions that I don't want to see your face again. The day that I see your face, you're going to die. And Moses replied and said, as you wish, you'll see my face again no more. And so what we have here is most likely him sending forth servants, servants of Pharaoh, to Moses, where he would be encamped with the Israelites, telling them, just get out of here, just go. Remember, he has agreed to let them go several times with restrictions, and even then, he would always back out. But he's at the point now where he sends word for them to go, do as you have said. And he says in verse 32, also take your flocks, your herds, as you have said, and be gone. But watch what he adds. And bless me also. But before you go, leave a blessing for me, which is kind of interesting, because the last time we see Pharaoh being blessed is when Jacob's on his deathbed. Right? And he blesses Pharaoh and Pharaoh's house because of what had been extended to Joseph and ultimately the Israelites, right? And so he likely has heard about that throughout the plagues, right? You have to think that some of these stories resurface. And, maybe Pharaoh that had forgot about Joseph had Joseph brought to his memory. Right? Stories that had been resurfaced. And you have to wonder, because he pointedly asked him to bless him. Verse 33, and the Egyptians were urgent upon the people. We've seen evidence that they've been urgent for some time. Pharaoh's been the one who has withheld, right? That they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, we be all dead men. In other words, they're like, man, let them go. We would rather work in their place fill the void that's obviously going to be left when slaves leave than to just be tortured and ultimately killed. And so verse 34 says, and the people took their dough before it was leavened. That was purposeful. Their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. It's amazing how willing they were to respond to Moses in obedience when God was doing extravagant and miraculous signs. Right? Remember, Moses and Aaron went to them and performed the signs that God had told them to. And initially they were like, wow, God's going to deliver us. Then there was a delay, right? The plagues start, Pharaoh resists. He adds to their labor and their toil, makes them go get their own straw. And what do? They start wavering in their faith. They're like, maybe Moses and Aaron are just morons, right? Maybe Yahweh hasn't sent them. And they start losing faith. They start losing hope. Why? Because they get their eyes on the circumstances, the pain, the toil, the enslavement. Nothing's changed for generations, so what makes them think things are going to change, right? But now, God has continued to up the plagues, up the signs, and Pharaoh has released them. Well, they're super willing to obey Moses. Now we're going to see when they get out in the wilderness and things get tough, they're going to change their minds again. And they're going to resist Moses and resist Yahweh and resist Aaron. And we're going to see this cycle for the next 40 years where when things are good, they believe, but when there's a challenge, Moses and Aaron, they're the problem, and they're wanting to go back to Egypt. But right now, all their firstborn is alive, and all the firstborns of Egypt are dead, and they're feeling really good about how things are going. And obviously, Pharaoh has sent the command for them to leave, and so they're excited about that as well. So, verse 35 again, at the top, the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they borrowed. I do not like the way the King James translates that word. They asked, because they're not borrowing. There's no reason that this should be translated borrow here, because the Hebrew word sha'al means to ask. They simply asked of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. Now, this is what Yahweh said in chapter 11 they were to do. And it makes perfect sense because the Egyptians are fed up with the Hebrews. They're wanting them out of there. And they're at the point, we don't care. You can have anything you want as long as you leave. And so it plays out just as planned. And so they asked for the jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment, the clothing. Now, all of these things we'll see as we progress through the book of Exodus will be used in what? In the service of the priesthood in the tabernacle, right? Because they're going to need gold and silver and copper for the instruments that will be used in the worship and servitude to Yahweh. And then they're going to need the raiment for the tabernacle as well as the priestly garments. And so all of these things that are happening right now are preparation for how they are to worship and serve Yahweh when they get out in the wilderness. So they're being freed from being slaves in Egypt, but they are going to become servants or slaves to Yahweh in a different way, a more liberating way in the wilderness. But they're not going to be freed and left to themselves, right? They're not going to become autonomous. They're going to be under the rule and the governance of Yahweh himself, which is why we'll see when they leave Egypt, after they get through the crossing of the Red Sea and get rid of Pharaoh and his army, they head to Mount Sinai, where they will receive instruction on how they are going to worship and how their lives will be lived as covenant people belonging to God. So verse 36, and the Lord gave the people favor, or chen, which is grace, in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them, or they gave them, such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. They were really just kind of getting their due, right? Because they had been worked for centuries without the proper retribution for what they had done. And so they get their due. But how many generations didn't get their due? Right? I've mentioned this before, but I have to say it. This is why the book of Revelation draws on the Exodus story in the plagues, in the triad pattern of the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, because the book of Revelation is trying to take the mind of the first century Christians back to the Exodus story and show them how there was centuries and years of injustice, but ultimately Yahweh prevailed and they were delivered. And so in Revelation, John is trying to tell those who are part of the seven churches who are receiving all of the injustice, right, that you read about in chapters 2 and 3, the things that they're having to endure because of being followers of Christ, to persevere, to endure. And he's kind of telling them, you're not going to be the generation that sees this great deliverance. You're going to live your whole lives fighting for your life, being ostracized, being persecuted, being done unjustly. But don't worry. There will come a day, just like there came a day in the Exodus, where justice will be served. And that's what we see here. Justice is finally served. But again, how many generations seen no justice? They lived their entire lives as slaves. Okay? So this should encourage us to be steadfast, to be diligent, and to endure come what may. So they spoiled the Egyptians. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses. This would be an updated place name that would be added by an editor later on. Let me see if I can pull up the map. It is so wonderful that I can click and it responds. There's no delay. There's no freezing. So the proposed site of Sukkot is right in here. Again, we don't know for sure where it is, but that's the proposed site. We're going to see that there's a lot of debate on the route of the Exodus as well, as we talked about earlier in this Exodus series. So they journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 on foot that were men besides children. How many of you had a chance to read that excursus that I put in the Facebook group about the possible number of Israelites that left? Okay? It would be extremely helpful for you to go and read that. Matter of fact, some of you aren't in our group, so we may read some of it if we have time. But there's a good possibility that this 600,000 footmen is not a literal number. Because when you think about the fact that if there's 600,000, men, basically, who would be as soldiers, then that means there's between, an estimate of 2 to 4 million Israelites in Egypt. And the archaeological data does not allow for that even being a possibility. There is just not enough ground space for that many human beings to live in the Nile Delta as they're described to have lived or even in the land of Canaan, right? You know, the land of Canaan's not that big, right? The size of New Jersey. And so it's been said time and time again to try to debunk the historical reality of the Exodus, that there is no way this number could be literal. And again, if you read this, there's a case to be made for the number not being literal. And I'll be the first one to admit that I used to be one of the sticklers that all of the numbers have to be literal in order for this to be true. But that's not how it was in antiquity. They functioned different in their literary writing, and numbers carried a lot more symbolism back then than they do for us in a postmodern culture. And so, again, I would encourage you to go read that excursus, because it is most likely and most probable and almost certain that there were not 2 to 4 million Israelites that left Egypt. Now, I remember, and I meant to pull up some pictures, and I'll try to have them for next week. I'll leave myself a note. But when we went into the Negev, which is southern Israel, down by the eastern portion of the Red Sea several years ago, Dylan was on that trip. We went to where they had a tabernacle at Timnah constructed. And you can look at it just as it would have been constructed according to the Torah. And it's out in the middle of the desert, the wilderness, and it's just completely barren. And we climbed a mountain, and I think I showed you some of those pictures a while back, but we climbed the mountain, and you can look, and I tried to envision 2 to 4 million people being there. And when you think about it, it just 2 to 4 million people is a lot of people, right? I mean, you think about some of the Coliseums where they have like NFL games and things like that. You're talking about thousands of people. Multiply that by thousands and not have tiers, right, or levels to stack people. That's what you would have had if these numbers are literal. So again, it's most likely that they were not literal. But what's also a part of this Exodus is the fact that it says in verse 38, and a mixed multitude went up also with them. What is a mixed multitude? Some of the Egyptians said, we're going with y'all, right? We're going with you guys. And so many people don't realize, and this will actually come back to bite them in the butt later on when you get into the book of Numbers and they get in the wilderness and things get tough. A lot of the Egyptians left with them. They left with the Israelites. And so there's a mixed multitude. You know, obviously it'd be mostly Hebrews or Israelites, but there were some Egyptians that left with them in the Exodus. And that right there is the answer to why we have the interruption when we get to verse 43 of who can participate in the Passover. Makes sense, because it's like Moses is writing, okay, there was a mixed multitude. Oh, by the way, here's how the Passover will function with those who are non-Israelites. And he'll give that legal matter, as we'll discuss. So there's a mixed multitude that went up also with them in flocks and herds, even very much cattle. The word cattle there is livestock. Okay, so don't be thinking just like cows and bulls, but livestock in general of various forms. In verse 39, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough, which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual or provision. Verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the host, or the armies of Yahweh, which they could hardly be called armies at this time, right? They have no military training at all, went out from the land of Egypt. Now we're going to focus on verse 40 and 41 for just a moment, because it mentions 430 years. And it says that on the selfsame day, hearkening back to something, right? 430 years to the day, they leave Egypt, which raises the question, 430 years from what? Because when you look in Genesis chapter 15, when the promise is made to Abraham that he's going to have offspring and that they're going to dwell, in a foreign land, it says 400 years, right? But here it says 430 years. And then you have in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17, Paul talks about 430 years. And he kind of sees it as being 430 years from the covenant made with Abraham, dating from that time forward. But here it makes it sound like that it's the complete time of the Israelites in Egypt. So which is it? Now what's interesting, when you look into the Septuagint, it says the sojourning of their land, of their time in Canaan and in Egypt. So that muddies the waters even more. And so I want to look at an entry here in one of the commentaries by Victor Hamilton. And he has a note here that we're going to read. It says, the note in verse 40 and 41 about the stay in Egypt, concluding after 430 years, seems to clash with Genesis 15:13, which says the period of time will last 400 years. Even the Septuagint is sensitive to this, and so renders Exodus 12:40 as, now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. It is common to say that the 430 is the exact number and 400 is a rounding off number. And this is him speaking here. I'm not so sure. And I would agree with him on this. Indeed, part of the problem here is determining when this 430 or 400 year period begins. And then he references a Jewish writing called the Book of Jubilees. And it says, hence, Jubilees 14:13 tabulates the 430 years to be from the time of Isaac's birth to the Exodus. Now, Paul seems to start it with the covenant made with Abraham in Genesis 15, based on what he says in Galatians 3. But Jubilees, which is a Jewish writing, starts it from Isaac's birth to the Exodus. Okay, so there's no unanimous or universal agreement here. He says, I think the best explanation is that offered by Brichto, and he references that, who has read both the Genesis and Exodus text literally and carefully. The longer era, 430 years, refers to the number of years of the Hebrews' sojourn in Egypt. The smaller number, 400 years, refers to the period of servitude that began some 30 years after Jacob and his sons came to Egypt and just after Joseph died. Now, I don't know if I agree with that. When you look at all the evidence and you look at Galatians and Genesis and you consider all of these factors, what the Septuagint says, my conclusion is, I don't know. We're missing some information that we need to know exactly what's going on here in the calculation. Obviously, Moses understood it and knew it. But this again proves the point that we are what? We're outsiders. And the reason we don't know is because this text wasn't written to us. Right? Wasn't written to us. Had it been, we would know. Because the fact that he doesn't have to go into explaining everything in great detail sheds light on the fact that the audience it was written to wouldn't need it to be completely explained, right? So again, we just have to throw our hands up in the air and say, I really don't know. And not knowing shouldn't hurt our faith. Right? Some people, it hurts their faith to not know some things about what's written in the Bible. If you actually do serious study, you're going to have a lot of moments where you just throw your hands up and say, I have no clue. And that's okay. Because again, the Bible was not written to us. Not a single word in the entire Bible was written to you or I. Not a single word. Not one word. Now we can all glean from it, benefit from it, learn from it. It's profitable for doctrine and anything you need in life. But we're still outsiders. And there's a lot of investigation that we need to engage in to understand much of the text. And sometimes we're just not going to know or have clear answers. This is one of those examples. Are y'all okay with that? The more you learn, the more comfortable you are with saying, I don't know. So he says in verse 42, it is a night to be much observed. That word observed, shamar, means to be guarded, kept, right? Kept near, valued unto the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generation. So the Passover and unleavened bread is to be kept from this point forward in their feast that are to be celebrated, and they are to be used as a means of communicating what God had done for them in delivering them from the bondage and the oppression of the Egyptians. Now, this is where, you challenge the parents to instill in the children the things of God. I mean, we live in a society that puts so much pressure on parents, to get their kids involved in a lot of activities. I mean, there are so many things that are offered. But what do you think God would want from parents more than anything? For them to get them involved in activities, whether that be ball or dance or cheer or all of the many options? Or do you think God would want there to be a priority on training children in the things of God? I mean, we could fast forward to Deuteronomy in chapter 6, the most infamous passage in all of the Torah for the governance of the Israelite life. And it said there that from the time you wake up, at noontime, at nighttime, you are to be instilling in the children the principles that Yahweh has set forth to govern their lives as the people of God, and what it means to be covenant people of God. And so again, I challenge you, parents and grandparents, to take advantage of that. Yes, spend time with your children and your grandchildren, playing with them, doing activities with them, but don't ever let that take precedence over instilling in them the values and the principles of the Lord, because He wants that more than anything, and those things will carry over throughout the rest of their life, right? So let's realize what's most important. Okay? Verse 43. And the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance, or the statute, the law of the Passover. There shall no stranger eat thereof. I'm going to say this in case I forget. What's interesting is that they keep this Passover. They're in the wilderness. A year goes by. They've received the Torah. They leave Sinai, or much of what's in the Torah. They leave Sinai at about the 1 year mark. Okay? They keep the Passover 1 year after they left Egypt. They still haven't arrived in Canaan, but they're to the point to where God wants them to arrive. right? They were to enter Canaan about 14, 15 months after they left Egypt, according to God's perfect plan, right? So they keep the first Passover, and you can read about that in Numbers. I think it's in chapter 9 off the top of my head. But then they fall apart. They get in the wilderness, things get tough. They go into complain mode. They bring back the evil report. God says, you know what? None of you are entering into the land of Canaan. You're all going to die in the wilderness because you can't trust me. And he had given them multiple opportunities to trust him. And they had every reason to. They never kept the Passover again. Never. Until they arrived in the land of Canaan. You know why? Because the Passover speaks of redemption. And because they failed to trust God and ignored God's word, God says, you're not going to participate in redemption. You're going to die in the wilderness because of your rebellious hearts. That's very interesting, and it's often overlooked that for 39 years they did not observe what celebrated their freedom. So, back to our text, there shall no stranger eat thereof. The stranger there should more appropriately be read foreigner. I think that's how the NET and other translations would have it. Foreigner, nechar. They will not eat. Now, we're going to see that there are actually cases where they can, but there are qualifications for doing so. But every man's servant that is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. So what is a requirement for participation? You have to have the seal of covenant, or the sign of covenant, which in a patriotic society was what? Circumcision. And so if we think ahead, remember Passover evolves into the Lord's Supper for Christians, right? What should be a qualification for anyone who participates in what we call communion or the Lord's Supper? They should be a Christian, but what is the seal of Christianity that has replaced circumcision? Baptism. And that is exactly what was taught in the early church. It's been avoided in a sensitive society such as ours. You know, we don't want to offend anyone by telling them, don't you dare eat of this unless you're a true Christian and you've been baptized. But certainly the Lord would require that and demand that for anyone who is to partake in the Lord's Supper, which is why you see in Paul's writings, we just covered it recently in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that he says you need to be careful in the manner in which you take of the Lord's Supper, or you can bring sickness or even death upon yourself. Why? It's a holy thing. It represents covenant. It represents redemption and ransom that was accomplished in and through Jesus Christ. And so we see that God doesn't change. He had requirements then, circumcision, and he has requirements today, right? So again, I'm just highlighting the character of God that is unchanging. So, verse 45, a foreigner, this word foreigner here is the Hebrew word toshav, which would be more like a resident alien, someone who's dwelling in the land, obviously the land of Canaan when they get there, but who is not a native-born Israelite. He's born somewhere else, and he just happens to live in the land. And a hired servant shall not eat thereof. In one house shall it be eaten. You shall not carry forth out of the flesh abroad out of the house. In other words, whatever house you bring it into to eat and partake of, it stays in that house and is consumed in the house. Neither shall you break a bone thereof. Wonder why there would be the stipulation on not breaking a bone. Perhaps the Passover meal is a foreshadowing of another event that might have taken place at Passover, right? When you read the Gospels, it says that when Jesus was on the cross, the soldiers went to break his legs as the thieves. He was already dead. That scripture might be fulfilled, that not a bone would be broken. And I believe that harkens back to this verse here, because this was certainly a foreshadowing of the final Passover lamb, which we know is Jesus, which is why John, of all gospel writers, records when John the Baptist declared, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which bears the sins of the world," because he would be the sin offering for the sins of the world. So there's so much here. We could really digress here about the typology and the foreshadowing, because it's very beautiful to see it be fulfilled, especially in the gospel narratives. Verse 47. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with you, and will keep the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as one that is born in the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. So again, why is he going into the specific legal matters of who can participate in the Passover? Because of verse 38 that speaks of the Egyptians that came with them. So what is Moses telling the Israelites need to happen for this mixed multitude that has come with them? Before the first Passover, they need to find a sharp rock and take care of business if they're going to eat the Passover and partake as the covenant people of God. But what else does it tell us? That the covenant that is commonly said to be only for the Hebrews was not only for the Hebrews, it was for anyone who had come under the covenant stipulation that was given to the Hebrews. Right? They had to become as the Hebrews in how they lived their lives, and coming under the governance and the teaching of Yahweh. Okay? So it wasn't only for the Israelites, contrary to what is commonly taught. Anyone who would be proselytized fully and converted could participate as Israelites with all the benefits. God doesn't change, folks. But there are stipulations, which tells us, how many of you have ever heard in church, just come as you are. Just come to Jesus as you are. Wait a second. Not so. You can't come with a hard heart. You can't come with an unrepentant heart. You can't do it. It's not true that you can come as you are. You got to come as a little child. And you got to humble yourself. And you have to be broken. And you have to realize the significance of your failures and your sins in reaching out to a just and holy God, seeking reconciliation on His terms under His conditions. Right? We don't just come to God as we please, as we are. That's a dangerous thing. But that's commonly taught. But it's not true. Verse 49. One law shall be to him that is homeborn and unto the stranger that dwells among you. One law for everybody. The same thing holds true today. The Torah, or the teaching of Jesus Christ, is universally binding for anyone who wants to come in covenant with the true and living God, Yahweh. You got to come on His terms under His law. I'm letting that rabbit run off because I just looked at the time. So just run on off. Verse 50. Thus did all the children of Israel, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. So again, it's real easy for them to do as God commands when everything is wonderful. Right? Did you know it's not hard to obey God when everything's wonderful? Yeah. Right? When He's doing supernatural signs and miracles and wonders. I mean, who needs faith? And how hard is it to trust God? Everything's going your way. But again, we will see it doesn't take them very long after they're in the wilderness to get full of discontentment and start. You know what happens when they get discontent? The pattern? Blame game. The blame game. It couldn't be my poor attitude, so it's got to be Moses' fault. We shouldn't have listened to that jerk. If we wouldn't have listened to him, we'd be back in Egypt. Oh, we'd be slaves. We'd be working like dogs. We'd be oppressed. We'd be under the domain and the influence of Egypt, which is an antitype of the world system. But boy, we would have some luxuries, right? They just get their eyes on everything negative that's going on. And we'll see that. But right now, everything's just peachy. Verse 51, and it came to pass the selfsame day that the Lord Yahweh did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies. That's where we're going to stop for tonight. And any questions? Larry?
Okay, back in 29, Lord struck all firstborns. So does that go back generations? Let's say my dad was the firstborn in his family. I'm the firstborn of his. Jen's the firstborn of ours. Justine was just, so they're all gone.
Yep. Anyone who was a firstborn child died.
I know, I just do that.
Now, think about it. You could have an 80-year-old firstborn in Egypt that night, and they would have died. Every firstborn would have died in Egypt, among man and beast.
But I think a lot of people just think, well, it's just the firstborn
Yeah.
of that family, and that's it.
Yeah, your mind automatically gravitates to thinking of children, but no, this would be anyone who is.
Makes it a little more devastating.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Amber?
That was my question.
Okay. Two of the same. Gary?
29.
29.
And it came to pass at midnight. So everything after midnight would be morning, correct?
It would be in the middle of the night, more appropriately read. B'chatzi alayla means in the middle.
Middle of the night. So then.
So
Pharaoh
you could say from midnight on, throughout the night,
Okay. So
death is taking place.
So where it said Pharaoh's rose in the night, even though it was after midnight, it's still considered night.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
that goes on. They got Moses and Aaron by night. I'm trying to get all the way over to 42, where it's talking again. It is the night of the solemn observance, and I'm trying to figure out if all of that happened in that 12-hour period.
Yeah.
From 29 to 42.
Yes.
Okay, that's
Yes.
what I was trying to get to.
Yep.
Basically.
Yep. They kill the Passover lamb or goat sometime in the afternoon even. They're in their homes, and sometime in the night after midnight, people start dying,
Right.
Animals start dying, and by morning, they're out of there.
Very good. That's really true.
Peggy?
Where in verse 36, where it's talking about plundered, you know, in other scriptures, when they use the word plundered, it's like they would go in and just totally devastate. Is that what's happening here?
No, because they asked for the items and they gave them willingly because they're ready for them to leave, which speaks of Yahweh did everything in this in contrast to what we'll see in the conquest. All of the plagues were all God, other than God using Moses and Aaron to kind of initiate the plagues. Obviously, the power came from God, and the plagues occurred because of God's power. But the spoiling of the Egyptians was compliant. It wasn't forced. Other than, I guess you could say, Yahweh usurping his authority over them and breaking their will through the plagues. but this would have been a compliant plundering or spoiling of the Egyptians.
Okay, and then in, where we're talking about the 600,000 men on foot, and when you read the thingy that you put on the Facebook page, and it said 25 to 30,000, could the scribes who were writing this, could they have just done that for effect?
Like exaggerative,
Yes.
possibly, because that was a common literary way of writing at that time.
Kinda like the coronavirus.
I mean, if you were to ask my opinion on how many Israelites left Egypt, I would say hundreds of thousands, but not millions, counting children and everyone.
And they're slaves. And
Yep. So,
concubines.
Amber?
Would the Egyptians have had the opportunity, the Egyptians left with the Israelites? Would they have had the opportunity to not have suffered the loss of their firstborn? So basically, would they have the opportunity to have already decided, hey, I didn't need 10 plagues to figure out that Yahweh's the God? So would there have been any that might have
That's
missed that?
That's a great question. Could you guys hear her? She asked if some of the Egyptians could have caught on before the 10th and final plague that Yahweh is the supreme God. There's actually evidence that they had. Many of them had, because they're telling Pharaoh, hey, let them go. You know, we're kind of losing everything here. And so she asked, could some of them had joined the Hebrews in their homes, participated in the Passover that night, and spared their firstborn under one condition based on all of the information we've just read. They'd have had to find a sharp rock and taken care of business. And I would say that it would have been allowable, for sure. The text doesn't tell us if that occurred. But I would say that would have to be done based on the law that was given. But then the case could be made is, well, if the law hadn't been given, then the law's not in effect.
Right.
And so maybe they could have gotten by with it, but then that's why God gave the stipulation, so that they would follow through with it. So you could go either way there. Argument could be made either way, because Paul uses the argument that, you know, if the law isn't given, the law isn't in effect. So I could go either way on that. Any other questions? Doug?
It says there in 36, maybe, no, 20, 30, maybe it's 35, and there was not one house without dead, or whatever it was there. So,
Yeah.
you know, and you would think that if you're doing retribution for the males that were thrown into the river, that it would just be the males, but it's hard to imagine there not being a house that wasn't touched, and there not being a household somewhere that had all girls.
Well, you have to consider their culture too, where you had large families and families, you know, extended families all living in the same vicinity. So, yeah, we just don't have enough information to know if this affected males or males and females.
Well, the other thing that I wanted to ask you was talking about the 400 years and 430 years. Does it say in the scripture where it says, and there arose a new king in Egypt, basically, that knew not Pharaoh, or that knew not Joseph? Does it say how long that was from the time they lived there?
No, there's no definitive timeline.
Because you could almost go back and say, well, they were living there, but they didn't come under the being servants and slaves like it was described to Abraham until a certain point, so I didn't know.
Based on what Paul says in Galatians 3:17, it almost seems like he views it as being 430 years that starts from the time of the covenant made with Abraham until the giving of the law. That's the way I read what he says in Galatians 3:17, because he's referencing the covenant made with Abraham could not be disannulled by the law given to Moses, which was 430 years after, is the way it said in Galatians 3 and 17. So, I have to think that Paul was more in the know and had more access to spot on information than any of us ever would, especially given his background. But still, at the end of the day, I just don't know for sure. That would be my leaning towards, the interpretation of it, but I don't know. Any others? Shane?
What's your stance on the carrying out of judgment and the personal format of the language that leads up to versus the execution of a lot of scholarly theoretical conversations take place that God never executes judgment. He brings judgment, it's justified, but he never executes it. It's done by the angel of the Lord or the destroyer, which is earlier in last week's. So what's your stance on that?
I would say ultimately if he gives the decree, then he's responsible for the death. But as himself actually, I don't know how you could even say this, tangibly being the one to walk through or stroll through Egypt that night, taking the lives, I would say this is where the divine counsel comes into play, and he would delegate for this assignment or this task to be carried out. And it would have been, I think, in Psalms it says he sent evil angels among them this night. I would have to go back and check, but that would be my view. Obviously, he's responsible for it. He said it would be so, and he takes responsibility for it. But I think he would have delegated that to lesser Elohim, would be the appropriate term, angels, we would say, whether they be good or bad. God, how many of y'all know God uses good and bad angels to carry out his plan and his will?
I see it every day.
So I would say that, he's responsible for it. He commanded it to be so, and he may have even used evil angels to be a part of that.
Yeah, it's just a strange narrative for Moses to write it that way, where he says, I, Yahweh, will walk through and I will execute, and then in the earlier passages, I will send the destroyer. And
Yeah.
It's just like a flip of the paradigm where you would almost want to tie that to I, Yahweh, and the person that executes to be, is that a Godhead thing? Like it's part of the trifecta?
I would see it as so, because the destroyer is commonly associated with the angel of the Lord, so which we would associate with pre-incarnate Christ.
Yeah.
So, yes to all of those.
Okay.
Any other questions? Holly?
Whenever you were talking about the Israelites not participating in Passover for the 39 years, so was that because did you say because they chose not to, or because God wouldn't let them?
I don't recall it being pointedly said why they don't. They just don't. And I would see that as the judgmental decree that was pronounced on them, that they're going to die in the wilderness. They were kind of cut off. He was pretty harsh when you go and see how God responded to them after the testing of the spies going into the land, because it was God's desire and plan at that point to go from Kadesh Barnea into the land of Canaan. I read about that in Numbers 14. And they just slandered God. 10 of the 12 spies came back and said, we can't do what God said and promised we could do. Even though he delivered us from the greatest nation in existence at the time, we're like grasshoppers to the Canaanites. There's no way. So essentially they were like, God, you're a liar. And God said, you'll die. And nothing will change that. And they did, except for Joshua and Caleb, because they happened to be the two spies that brought, obviously an agreeable report with what God said. Yeah, there are giants in the land. Yeah, there are walled cities and people that are more advanced in military power. But Yahweh is backing them. And that's what they failed to trust in, and so they were severely punished for it.
They didn't carry it out because they didn't have any doorposts to paint them.
Exactly. Any other questions?
Could that be that foreigner is often tied to, like, when the Israelites or the people of God are cast out because of their idolatry and their adultery toward God, they are called foreigners.
Mm-hmm.
You are now a foreigner and you will be cast out. Could
Mm-hmm.
that tie to that in verse 43 where it says no foreigner shall eat of it? Could that be a possibility?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Be seen as cut off from covenant.
Yeah. Therefore a foreigner.
A principle of being cut off from covenant. Yep. And that's how God would have viewed him while they wandered in the wilderness. He's just waiting for them to die off, so a new generation can come up that will trust and obey and go in the land.
So the Jehovah's Witness would have been right during that 39 years. That was it.
I ain't going there. Any other questions, Teresa?
Well, you know, God gives us a choice, so really, wouldn't they have had a choice, you know, to do it and it was right, you know, on God's side? God would have been right, because he gives us a choice.
Are you saying as far as them keeping the Passover during those 39 years?
I mean, they kept it before.
Yeah, obviously it was God's plan and desire for them to keep it from this night forward generationally.
Yes.
But there came a point where they failed to trust God, where he cut them off from being in covenant with him. And they died not receiving the promises.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there is no evidence whatsoever of them keeping it during that time. Matter of fact, it's pointedly said, if I recall, in Joshua that, you know, they finally were able to keep it again as they entered into the land. So,
Was there an age limit of ones that did not go into the promised land?
the generation that left Egypt
Yeah.
would not be the generation that entered Canaan except for Joshua and Caleb. Which shows you what you do affects others. 10 spies cost an entire nation their inheritance.
Other than the kids.
Yeah. Yep. So the majority doesn't rule. Never has in the Bible, ever. So, you know, going with the flow is not always the best option.
They rule, they just don't do a very good job.
Exactly. Any others?